Hello friend! Starting your journey in Terraria and wondering what class to go for to have the easiest time? Well, you've come to the right place. I'll briefly cover the classes in Terraria, from easiest to hardest, so you can decide for yourself whether you want something simple or something that takes a bit more brain power to handle. I'm Zuzucorn and I aim to entertain, encourage, and offer you a place to call home, so subscribe now and join the Zuzucorn family. Let's begin. Number 1. The easiest class to play in Terraria is arguably having no class at all. To be clear here, Terraria doesn't really shoehorn you into picking one specific weapon type. This means that if you want, you can use this cool scythe you found, then swap to this nice bow that dropped, then use a summon or two as bonus supports. With no real limitation, you can do whatever you want and can adapt to the situation as you like. You might be wondering then, why pick a class and limit yourself? Well, the answer lies in armor sets. Most armors specialize in buffing a specific weapon type. For example, the Spectre armor is magic weapon based, while the Shroomite armor is ranged based. Armors provide boosts to damage and other class specific benefits, like extra summon slots, mana regeneration, or ammo conservation. If you want to optimize your damage and utility, it's usually wise to pick something to specialize in. This doesn't mean that you have to be limited specifically to only an archetype though. It's your playthrough, so feel free to use predominantly ranger weapons, but still use a summon or two. Or you could use melee to deal with close-up enemies. But moving on, I'll be referring to mostly the main 4 archetypes, should you wish to specialize in one. Number 2. The easiest of the 4 main classes is the Ranger class. At least that's what I think. Rangers can safely attack from range, giving them more space to dodge attacks and more allowance to roam around. The ability to keep a safe distance is pretty significant in this game, since enemies can hurt quite a bit, especially in expert mode. Ranger armors also don't feature a lot of defense, but that is well compensated by the distance you can place between you and enemies. One troublesome aspect of Ranger play is ammo and ammo conservation, but that can usually be brute forced through sheer numbers. The only real challenge with Rangers is aiming, but even that isn't too big of a deal. In that vein, gunners have it slightly easier than archers. Most guns shoot pretty straight, so you don't have to lead your shots all that much. The main drawback of certain guns is that they have very inconsistent and wide bullet spreads. For example, the chain gun is really strong and fires a lot, but the bullets kind of go everywhere. Still, you can get past that by either using the auto-homing chlorophyte bullets or something like the nano bullets, which bounce towards enemies. For archers, arrows are affected by gravity, so some amount of preempting is required to be effective. But even that challenge is reduced when you speed up arrows with a magic quiver or use arrows with naturally faster flying speeds. Overall, the range class is a rather straightforward one that is pretty easy to get into, and it's also extremely strong, so pick this one if you want the easiest and most approachable time. Number 3. The next easiest class would probably have to be the melee class. In Terraria, the melee class has lots and lots of different weapons and subtypes, and it even consists of things that you wouldn't think were melee. Some examples include weapons like the Flying Knife, Shadow Flame Knife, and the Scourge of the Corruptor. There is even a whole subclass called the Yo-Yo class, which is exclusively a melee class at a distance. Personally, I love how unique the Yo-Yo subtype is because it follows your cursor, and the accessories it has are pretty interesting as well. They can double your yo-yos and give you a balancing counterweight to protect you from enemies. Back to the point though, most melee weapons are not truly limited to melee range. The swords you get at the start of the game are like that, but eventually you start obtaining swords that also fire off some projectile, or are just so absurdly big that it doesn't really matter. I will add a small disclaimer here though. If you want to avoid all weapons that have range or projectiles, the community refers to that as true melee, and don't get me wrong, going exclusively true melee is extremely difficult, but for melee in general with no limitations, it's not so bad. To add to that, melee armors provide a lot of defense compared to the other classes, and that makes melee a lot more forgiving to play. Of course, you can't just face tank all the enemies and bosses and expect to win, but melee is very instinctive and well-rounded. It's another great starting point for new players. Number 4. One of the more difficult classes which require more resource management would be the Mage Class. Mages use magic weapons, of which there are tons and tons of. The great thing about mages is that there are so many types of weapons and they all have cool effects and vary in styles. We have things like the Bloodthorn, which damages enemies with spikes, the Crystal Serpent, which shoots a projectile that splits, the Meteor Staff, which summons meteors from above, and so on. Once you beat the game, you even get a freaking laser beam. How can you beat that? Well, the main issue here is mana. Using magic weapons costs mana, and you only have a limited amount at the very beginning of the game. You can increase your max mana by consuming mana crystals, which are made from fallen stars, but that's something you don't have to do if you simply don't play mage. The main issue is that mana doesn't effectively regenerate while you're using it, which means that as you fire away at the enemy, you need to occasionally take a pause and let your mana regenerate first before you continue. That said, mana regeneration potions are also almost essential if you want to be optimal with your playthrough. So if you think that dealing with resource management is alright, then Mage is definitely really fun and fulfilling for you to play. Now, there is an accessory called the Mana Flower, which lets you drink mana potions automatically when you run out. That's actually great and removes this whole resource management issue. However, the big drawback here is that drinking mana potions gives you the mana sickness debuff, which reduces your overall damage output. Strictly speaking, if you want to be really lazy, just brute force your way through most of the content by spamming mana potions like this. But if you do want to be optimal, then the regeneration method is much more efficient and effective in most cases. Regardless of which you choose, you have to admit that playing a mage comes with a lot more complications than if you just played melee or something. Number 5. Lastly, the Summoner class. To me, the Summoner class is the hardest class to get into, and the effort to return ratio isn't really that worth it. Don't get me wrong though, I love the Summoner class and it's usually my go-to loadout, but there are just some things that make the class more difficult than the others. To start, we have the summons. There are lots and lots of cool summons out there, and honestly they can do a buttload of damage, but there are also a couple of not so good ones. I guess you could say the same for every class, but some of the summoner stress comes from how summons may not behave as you want them to. Terraria has gotten a few great updates for summoner though, and you can now target specific enemies by right-clicking, which will make your summons home in on that enemy. But this takes time and some summons just aren't very speedy or accurate. Some that come to mind is the Tiki Staff, which summons little Tiki warriors. They're great, but are extremely atrocious at hitting flying enemies cause they just don't lead their shots. The Raven Staff is also amazing, but the Ravens are generally quite slow and spend most of the time catching up to speedy bosses. In summary, you really need to look out for the right summons for the right situation. Generally speaking, summons that never miss are considered better or more consistent, so something like the Xeno Staff, the Sanguine Staff, or the Blade Staff would probably serve you much better. Apart from managing your summons, you also have Whips, which are the summoner's personal damage dealing weapon of choice. Whips deal summon damage, and tagging an enemy with a whip will enhance the damage done by your summons. A standard fight would just be you whipping the bosses into submission while your summons have at it. Whips are really cool though, and they also come with some special effects. But my main gripe about summoner whips is that if we have to get up close to whip the boss, then why do summoners have the lowest defense among all the classes? Well, true, summoners do have the potential to do amazing damage, and I guess it's a trade-off, but still it's a little counterintuitive. Summoner is one of those great glass cannon classes, but even then it might not do as much damage as a mage or ranger, who are just so much more consistent in general. To conclude, summoners just feel like a very high effort class to play, even though it's really fun, but it takes so much more care and thought to play effectively. So if you're just starting out and want to experience the content first, I wouldn't really recommend Summoner. It's a great second or third playthrough class though, or I guess if you're up for a challenge, just dive in and hope for the best. Well, that about sums up what I wanted to say for this video. At the end of the day, just play whatever you find fun. Personally, I do love Summoner, and I think the fun factor outweighs all the trouble that I need to go through. But still, some things are a little annoying, and I wonder whether it's even worth it. But yes, play whatever you want. I'm lazy, so I play Summoner. Well, I hope this video gives you a general idea on how difficult each class may be in Terraria. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe for more Terraria and other stuff. This has been Zuzucorn. Have a nice day, and have a great week ahead. Bye bye!